Hey listeners, this is Ben, the Amateur Exegete, and you're listening to episode 32 of Bible Study for Amateurs. Today's episode is Papias, Mark, and Slaves. Writing sometime during the early 2nd century CE, Papias, the bishop of Hierapolis, wrote the following concerning the origin of the Gospel of Mark. And the elder used to say this: Mark, having become Peter's interpreter, wrote down accurately everything he remembered, though not in order, of the things either said or done by Christ. For he neither heard the Lord nor followed him, but afterward, as I said, followed Peter, who adapted his teachings as needed, but had no intention of giving an ordered account of the Lord's sayings. Consequently, Mark did nothing wrong in writing down some things as he remembered them, for he made it his one concern not to omit anything that he heard, or to make any false statement in them. These words, a translation from Michael Holmes's 3rd edition of the Apostolic Fathers, are quoted by the historian Eusebius in his Ecclesiastical History from around the 4th century. They mark the earliest extant record, tying Mark's version of Jesus' story to that of the disciple Peter. And while various scholars have debated the validity of Papias' claims and that of his source, the elder, not many have investigated its reception, specifically its depiction of Mark. But in a paper entitled Fashioning Mark, Early Christian Discussions about the Scribe and Status of the Second Gospel, that appeared last year in the journal New Testament Studies, historian Candida Moss considers this very thing. In particular, Moss queries how readers in the 2nd century, when Papias was writing, would have understood Mark's role in his service as Peter's so-called interpreter. Moss observes that by ascribing the Gospel of Mark ultimately to the teaching of the Apostle Peter, the text now has an apostolic imprimatur from one of the leading figures of the Jesus movement. It almost goes without saying that Peter is an important figure, not only in Mark's account, but in the other Gospels and the Acts of the Apostles as well. Tying the Markan Gospel to one of Jesus' most important followers gave it an air of authority. New Testament scholar Michael Koch suggests in his book, The Gospel on the Margins, The Reception of Mark in the 2nd Century, that this connection was partially intended to make Mark safe for the canon. In Koch's estimation, the Gospel of Mark, an originally anonymous gospel text, had been used by rivals of the proto-Orthodox position. Tying the text to Peter gave proto-Orthodox Christians the cover to use it in their own congregations and, in the words of Koch, it delegitimized the readings of dissident groups that fell outside the approved lines of apostolic succession. In this way, Papias' words were genius, a move that all but guaranteed Mark's place in what would become the New Testament canon. As interesting a rabbit hole this would be to go down, Moss's own concerns lie elsewhere. When Papias claims Mark was Peter's interpreter, how did early readers understand that? Interpreters, she notes, were used in a variety of situations: military strategy, commercial transactions, legal affairs, and so on. Typically, the work of an interpreter was rarely acknowledged. And who did such work? Moss writes, most of this uncredited work was performed by slaves or servile figures, whose competence in more than one language made them assets to their owners, but whose social status meant that both their identities and their work are generally omitted from the historical record. Given that interpreters were generally of lower status, it seems reasonable to think Papias is depicting Mark as a slave, though it isn't clear whose slave he is. What is clear is that given the historical context of Papias's words, Mark and Peter would not have been considered social equals. Arguing against the claim of Richard Bauckham that Peter and Mark were collaborating, Moss writes that this would not have been how a reader of Papias's words would have understood the relationship. In New Testament scholarship, she writes, the social status of ancient slave writers is often unconsciously elevated to that of an associate or volunteer, but the ordinary way for an ancient reader to understand the character of Mark's work was that of a slave. But why doesn't Papias just come out and say Mark's a slave? For starters, he may not have been. He may have been a freedman. But even if he wasn't, given the way in which secretaries, that is, people who dictated writing on behalf of others, were viewed, Mark's identification as an interpreter or translator, as well as the service he provided, would have communicated his status to Papias's audience as a servile worker. Additionally, portraying him as such would help explain why, in his words, the Gospel of Mark lacks order. Mark was simply unrefined. Relegating Mark to a secretary and not an author, then, accomplishes two things. It speaks to the truthfulness of what he wrote with regards to Peter's preaching, and it explained why it wasn't exactly a work of literary art. To quote Moss, its inelegance, in fact, paradoxically serves as a guarantee of its accuracy. Readers often overlook the role slaves played in tasks we take for granted today. In the Greco-Roman world, slaves were everywhere, doing almost everything. Everett Ferguson, in his book Backgrounds of Early Christianity, notes that so numerous were slaves in Rome that when a proposal was made in the Senate to have them wear clothing that identified them as such, it was shot down, per Ferguson, lest the slaves learn how numerous they were. Slaves were property, first and foremost, but often didn't get the credit they deserved. And we can see here, in the case of Mark with Peter, even when they do, it is nevertheless at their personal expense. That's all the time we've got this week. See you next time, and remember, in the words of Richard Elliott Friedman, one does not need to deny what is troubling about the Bible in order to pay respect to what is heartening. Thanks for listening.